Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. That's the famous first line of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Of the Social Contract. Hello, that's the essay that we're going to be talking about in this video. As that title might imply to you, Rousseau was a social contract theorist, which puts him in the same kind of vein as people like John Locke and Montesquieu. However, Rousseau does differ in some important ways from people like Locke, who I've done a video on before. But basically, the central idea here, the central idea in Of the Social Contract, is that the social contract functions in a specific way, that mankind, and this is mankind in the gendered sense, because Rousseau, like Locke, doesn't really consider women as proper political subjects. But the idea here, as with Locke's discussion of the state of nature, is that humanity comes together out of a non-governed state and gives up certain rights and privileges in order to enter into society that provides protection and security. So he says here, starting from the very beginning, the assumption of social contract theory is the state of nature. And Rousseau says here in chapter 2 of the First Societies, this common liberty is a consequence of man's nature. His first law is to attend to his own survival. His first care is owed to himself, and once he reaches the age of reason, as sole judge of the means appropriate for survival, he thereby becomes his own master. So the family is, if you will, the first model for political societies. The ruler is the image of the father. The people is the image of the children, and all, having been born equal and free, alienate their liberty only where this is useful to them. So, human beings enter into society from a state of complete freedom in the state of nature. Like Locke, oddly enough, Rousseau more or less makes the argument that this means that slavery in effect can't exist, which of course requires ignoring the fact that slavery did and does in fact exist. But ideologically, within the structure the structure and the assumptions of social contract theory, which assumes that a person cannot give away more power over themselves than they themselves have, slavery is inconceivable. Again, this runs into the practical problem of slavery actually exists. How do you deal with that? Well, the social contract theorists kind of don't. They kind of brush over this as a philosophical problem rather than an empirical problem that needs to be dealt with in terms of how reality actually functions. So that's what it is. But basically the idea, the central question for the social contract theorists is, what does it mean that society exists? How does society function at the most basic level? And so in chapter 6 of The Social Pact, Rousseau takes us through a lot of his core ideas about how society works and how the social contract functions. He says here, how to find a form of association that will, with the whole common force, defend and protect the person and goods of each associate, and through which each individual, while uniting with all, will nevertheless obey himself alone and remain as free as before. Such is the fundamental problem to which the social contract gives the solution. So that's the way that the social contract theorists, particularly Rousseau, see this issue. The foundation of society is grounded on this need to balance between individual liberty, as we had in the state of nature, which, by the way, is not a real historical period. There was no actual state of nature. And the social contract theorists, particularly somebody like Locke and to a lesser extent Rousseau, often sort of ignore the fact that that's a political allegory rather than an actual historical period. But how do you balance the liberty of the theoretical state of nature versus the reality of a society in which there are methods of control in order to get social goods like protection, security, etc., etc.? This is here. I'm gonna go to this one because this is really Rousseau's big innovation. It says here, so if you eliminate from the social pact what is not essential to it, you will find it is reduced to the following terms. Each of us places his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and as a body we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Instantly, in place of the particular person of each contracting party, this act of association produces a corporate and collective body composed of as many members as the assembly has votes, a body that receives from this very act its unity, its common self, its life, and its will. So this is really Rousseau's big innovation. Basically, he introduces the idea of the common will, or the general will. What he means by that is not super clear, because he seems to have this conception that there is a general social desire, or there's a general fundamental human desire, at least within particular societies, for the same kind of outcome. He divides the general will against individual wills. So what individuals want is to be essentially to be ignored. What factions want is essentially to be ignored. And this is one of the big influences on somebody like Madison, the U.S. president and author of the Federalist Papers, who was very opposed to factions. Rousseau makes the argument that these are partial wills. They don't represent the will of the whole, but somehow the people as a collective, the entire body politic, represents the general will. It's not super clear how this works because at different times of the social contract, Rousseau talks about this in slightly different ways. But in chapter 3 of, I think, book 2, the section, whether the general will can err, he says here, there's often a great deal of difference between the will of all and the general will. The latter takes account only of the common interest. The former takes account of private interest and is only a sum of particular wills. But removed from these same wills the pluses and minuses that cancel each other out, and what is left as the sum of differences is the general will. Not entirely clear what that means until you start sort of thinking about it in contrast to something like Marxist social conflict theory. And it occurred, like, this is one of the things I really actually struggled quite a bit with wrapping my head around of the social contract, because you can't, if you live in a sort of post-Marxist world, the way that we all do, we tend to look at society as sets of competing interests. This is, from a sociological perspective, Marx's big innovation. The idea that society is made up of classes that compete with one another. Rousseau starts from the absolutely opposite perspective. He believes that fundamentally society is made up of a unified group, that fundamentally the people within society all want the same thing, and it's only by sort of artificially dividing themselves or refusing to look at the common interest, that becomes distorted. You have to sort of wrap your head around that idea in order to understand Rousseau. I think the idea of the general will depends on the assumption that society is fundamentally coherent and unified rather than sets of divided competing interests. And actually, John Stuart Mill's essay Of Liberty points out this limitation in the early portion of the introductory section. He basically says one of the problems with early thinkers of liberalism is that they assumed a coherent society rather than competing interests making up a society. This is one of the big problems with Rousseau. If you don't start from that assumption that basically everybody shares the same interests and wants ultimately the same thing as the common good, Rousseau's argument doesn't make any sense, really. So this is what you have to sort of figure out here. The general will was based on the opposite assumption of social conflict theory. It's based on the opposite assumption from what we now generally hold to be true, which is that there are competing factions in society and they don't share fundamentally the same interests. The fact that Rousseau was writing this, I mean, he was from Switzerland. He lived a lot in France, and he wrote of the social contract in 1762. So, I mean, Switzerland was somewhat representative. It had a somewhat representative democracy. France, on the other hand, 1762, is still an authoritarian absolute monarchy. The claim that Mill makes, and I think there's something to this, is that one of the fundamental reasons that a lot of these early liberal thinkers, like Mill, like Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, don't fully understand how democracy works or how representative government works, is because they were imagining it from the perspective of people who lived mostly in absolute monarchies. And there's another bit here. There's another thing that really struck me when I was reading Of the Social Contract. He says here, this is, figure this out. This is in chapter 6 of the Monarchy, which I think is chapter 6 of book 3. He says here, an essential and inevitable defect which will always place monarchical below republican government is the fact that in the latter the public vote almost never raises to the foremost positions any other than enlightened and capable men who fill these with honor, whereas those who advance to them in monarchies are most often merely petty blunderers, petty rogues, petty schemers, who make use of the petty talents that in courts bring advancement to great positions only to reveal their ineptitude to the public as soon as they have reached them. The people err in his choice far less than the prince. I think the 2016 election begs to differ. Oh, brother. Representative government, representative elections are very capable of putting incompetent, inept, corrupt people into office. But again, 1762, so didn't necessarily know that.